And now John Waite looks at the career of one of British opera's most controversial and today neglected tenors, the singer they called the Lancashire Caruso.
Right, Mrs. Goldshaw, if you'll just roll one of those tickets out, please.
In a small bar behind a Lancashire working men's club, a small group of enthusiasts gathers to commemorate a largely forgotten local singer who died more than a quarter of a century ago.
This is a mystery prize, you see. All right, very well.
The prize draw pays for the hire of the hall, in which the Tom Burke Appreciation Society meets rather irregularly to hear his records on a wind-up gramophone. And that's more or less all that remains of the reputation of Tom Burke, opera star. And yet, in his day, Burke was a sensation. On his Covent Garden debut, he outshone the legendary Melba. Fated by Caruso and Puccini, the press hailed him as the finest tenor England had produced.
You are my heart's delight, and where you are, I long to be. You make my darkness bright, when like a star, you shine on me. Dreams of mine may perchance come true, and I shall hear you whisper, I love you.
But within 2 decades, Tom Burke was a penniless has-been, ostracized by agents and shunned by society. Over the next hour, with the help of his own memoirs and the recollections of his friends and family, we piece together the story of the tenor's remarkable rise and fall. A story in which wine and women loom as large as song. A story quite as extraordinary as the plot of any opera. It begins a century ago in the small Lancashire mining town of Lee. It was here in 1890 that Tom Burke was born, the first of 9 children of an immigrant Irish collier. Almost as soon as he could walk, young Tom displayed musical ability. He later sang in the local church choir, and his parents scrimped and saved to buy him a piano. But at the turn of the century, childhood ended early. At 12, Tom went to work in a silk mill, and at 14, followed his father down the pit.
I used to walk 4 miles from my home to the pithead each morning. And then there was another 3 or 4 miles underground. And for the best part, the road to the workings was so shallow that you couldn't stand upright. We had to be down, right down on the job at 6 o'clock, and we didn't come up until 4 in the afternoon, and there was still that 7 or 8 miles to walk, underneath and on top when the day's work was done.
But Burke refused to give up his ambition to become a singer, an ambition fueled when he walked the 60 miles to Blackpool and back to hear the great Caruso in concert at the Winter Gardens. Though just 19, he redoubled his efforts to follow in the footsteps of his idol, taking on a part-time insurance round and selling tripe in local pubs whilst serenading the customers, all to earn enough for singing lessons. Though his workmates teased him about the long walk to Blackpool, who was Caruso wrestling, one inquired, it was a different story underground. So good was the young miner's voice that his fellow colliers would often ask him to down tools and sing while they took on his work. What they wanted were Irish ballads, and soon Burke was known as the Minstrel Boy, after the song that was to remain a favourite encore throughout his career. As his biographer John Vose explains, it was these impromptu sing-alongs with the miners that were to give Tom his big break.
Well, one night when Tom was coming home with his colliery mates from the pits, they'd been doing a shift They were singing, and they were passing a house which was owned by a Mr. Swarbrick, and he was a local organ player and a music teacher, and his wife was a musical comedy singer, and she was bathing the baby, and the singing woke up the child, and she came out. Anyway, she was rather impressed by one of the singers, who, of course, was Tom. The next day, the gang came past, and Mr. Swarbrick himself was in the house, and she said, "Come and listen to this man." And as luck would have it, Tom was singing a solo this time, and it was a very appropriate piece of music for Tom to pick. It was called Lend Me Your Aid from the Queen of Sheba by Gounod. And, of course, Mr. Swarbrick heard it, and he did lend Tom his aid. He said, "Come tomorrow night, we're having a music evening." So Tom scrubbed himself up, put his best bib and tucker on, and went very, very nervously, music in hand, and sang for the Swarbricks.
The minstrel boy to the war is gone. In the ranks of death you'll find him. His father's sword he has girded on, and his wild heart slung behind him. Land of songs and the warrior pod, all the world be to raise thee. One sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful heart shall praise thee. The minstrel fell, but the foeman's chain could not bring his proud soul under. The harp he loved ne'er spoke again, for he tore its heart asunder.
So impressed were the Swarbricks that they arranged for Burke to leave the pit for full-time study at the Manchester School of Music, and some months later he auditioned for the city's Halle Choir. The choir master was unimpressed and turned him down, but the Halle's conductor had chanced to hear the audition, and he thought otherwise. Taking the novice aside, he told him a London impresario, Hugo Gorelitz, was in Manchester looking for talent. Burke should approach him. Burke did, and at a meeting brokered by the conductor in the Midland Hotel, he signed a contract. Gorelitz would find him work at London concerts in exchange for 50% of the fee, and Burke would have the opportunity of studying music in the capital. And so, at the age of 23, the young Lancastrian made his way south, a professional singer at last, albeit of drawing-room ballads.
Darling, I am growing old. Silver threads among the gold shine upon my brow today. Life is fading fast away. But my darling, you will be always young and fair to me. Yes, my darling, you will be always young and fair to me.
Burke soon discovered that ballad singing was a crowded profession and far from an easy life. If the agent Gorelitz found him work, he ate and paid for private singing lessons with Signor Edgardo Levi at the Royal Academy. If Gorelitz failed, there were no singing lessons and the tenor went hungry. It was in just such a fallow period that Burke was to meet his future wife.
For weeks, nothing had come my way. And for 3 days, no food had passed my lips. I was feeling pretty desperate. I was right up against it.
There was nothing for it, he resolved, but to go to Gorelitz's office and insist on receiving an advance.
On entering, I was met by a face that was new to me. A girl with raven hair and finely chiselled features. I told her I was hungry and wanted an advance. She didn't say anything, but went over to her bag, extracted £0.50 and with a smile handed it across to me. Oh, I'm not ashamed to say I took it gladly, and had one of the most memorable feeds in the whole of my existence.
The girl behind the desk, Mari Alfaldich, was in fact another aspiring concert artist from a well-to-do London family. She was as pretty as Burke was handsome. Romance blossomed after Gorelitz suggested they tour together, and marriage quickly followed. Thereafter, the couple moved in with Mari's parents, where life for Burke was a good deal more comfortable. The late Dame Eva Turner, a student with Burke, remembered visiting them there.
He was studying with Edgardo Levi, who was also my professor of voice, and they asked me over for a Sunday, which was a red letter day for me because I was in digs, you know, student digs, and I had a lovely time with them, so I knew them quite well. He rather had the air of a man about town, you know. I think he enjoyed the good things of life.
For Burke's agent, Hugo Gorelitz, however, life was a good deal less comfortable. War had broken out, and, being of German extraction, he was interned. In an effort to protect Burke's future, or perhaps his own pocket, he offered to sell Burke's contract to his tailor, a man called Mark Richardson Moore, who worked out of Bond Street. The tailor pointed out that Gorelitz still owed him for a 3-piece suit, and so, after some haggling, Burke's money-making potential changed hands for the price of a suit. Mark Richardson Moore had always admired Burke's singing. He also had a bargain, because before long an important visitor at the rooms of Signor Edgardo Levi of the Royal Academy, where Burke remained a pupil.
One day, Edgardo Levi came to me. "Burke," he said, "I want you to sing your best today. Signor Caruso will be here." Well, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Many was the time I'd stood outside Covent Garden for hours, having gone without a meal, so I could hear this greatest singer the world has ever known. The great man came in. I'll never forget him. I felt as though my throat would burst. I sang. At the end, he applauded, mildly. Then he spoke to Mr. Levi and came across to me. Caruso stretched out his hand and clasped mine. Oh, it was a wonderful moment. "In the days to come," he said with a smile, "you will wear my mantle." I don't remember what I answered, but Caruso turned to Mr. Levi and said, "He must go to Italy. It's there he will find his voice." Journey to Italy was a great adventure. I gazed out at the countryside as the train sped along and dreamed more dreams. It was going to be easy, I thought.
The Burkes, funded by the tailor Mark Richardson Moore, settled in Milan, where Tom studied under the Italian tenor Colli, and a daughter, Patricia, was born. In summer, it was bliss, and Tom would supplement his allowance from the tailor by working as a bet placer for professional gamblers at the San Siro racecourse. More importantly, Burke learned Italian. His Lancashire accent disappeared as he acquired the art of speaking and singing clearly, along with other tricks of the trade that only seasoned professionals can pass on. According to Joe Winstanley, a student of early recordings and an authority on Burke's work, this was the most crucial period in the singer's development. It turned him from an also-ran into a potential star.
Because Italian language consists of clear, round, shining vowel sounds, he will have learned to dispel the Lancastrian vowel sounds and take into his technique the Italian vowel sounds, which would make for a brighter, clearer, rounder tone.
The training paid off when, in 1916, Burke successfully auditioned for the tenor lead in Rigoletto at Milan's Lyric Theatre, and no part could have better suited him than that of the licentious Duke, who declares women are fickle.
La donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento, muta da cielo e di pensiero, sempre un amabile, leggiadro viso, in pianto e in riso e menzognero. La donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento, muta da cielo e di pensiero, e di pensiero.
The audience was delighted. More performances at the Lyric followed, and then the offer of an engagement at the San Carlo Theatre in Naples. Burke badly wanted the job and needed the money, but as his daughter Patricia subsequently learned from her mother, the journey south hit an unexpected hitch.
Tom went first. Mother couldn't go to begin with because they didn't have enough money, and when he got to Naples, I don't know who it was, but somebody out of the mafia said, "Oh no, mate, you are not singing here. We don't need English tenors to sing here. We've got enough Italian tenors. And you won't sing here." And he didn't sing there.
Instead, the Burkes went to Palermo in Sicily, home of the mafia, but where the foreign tenor was able to appear. More good fortune followed when Tom was called up to sing in Pietro Mascagni's new opera La Loletta after the first choice tenor, Beniamino Gigli, was called up for national service. But as his reputation grew, Burke too was called up, although once back in Britain he was passed unfit for service, not on the grounds of any physical defect, but apparently on the basis that he could do more for the war effort on the stage than in any trench. And so, in 1918, it was back to the ballads, this time for the services and service charities.
Roses are shining in Picardy, in the hush of the silver dew. Roses are flowering in Picardy, but there's never a rose like you. And the roses will die with the summertime, and our roads may be far, far apart, but there's one rose that dies not in Picardy. 'Tis the rose that I keep in my heart.
The war was over within months, and the Burkes pondered what to do next. Then, out of the blue, came a staggering offer. Throughout the conflict, the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden had been closed. Now there was to be a grand reopening for the 1919 season. The work chosen was Puccini's tragic love story set amongst the poor artists of Paris, La Bohème. It was to be conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham, and the great Nellie Melba was the natural choice for the soprano role Mimi. But there was no obvious choice for the tenor Rodolfo. Unknown to Burke, Melba had heard him sing in Italy and had been enormously impressed. Now she insisted, and she was in a position to insist, that that part went to the Lancastrian. The musical world was stunned. Burke was completely unknown in England. He'd never appeared at Covent Garden, or indeed in any professional operatic production in this country. In the days leading up to the royal reopening in front of the King and Queen, press speculation mounted. Would this unknown singer be up to it? No man in London had more to prove than Tom Burke.
The day had dawned when I was to achieve the ambition which every singer sets out to attain, appearing at Covent Garden. And this was another red-letter day in my career. It was a long jump from the coal mine.
Long before the curtain rose at Covent Garden last night, the grand old theatre was well nigh full. Queues had been waiting all day outside the unreserved portions of the house. The red draperies of the boxes, the grey carpet, the blue-grey ceiling, even the faces of the attendants. Surely it was just a week ago and not July 1914 that Covent Garden was last open. Before even the footlights glowed on the great red curtain, every stall and box seemed to be occupied, and there was a quarter of an hour or more of merry chatter. When the curtain rose on the first act, everyone was anxious for the first notes of Mr. Tom Burke, the new Lancashire tenor. A few minutes sufficed to satisfy us that there was no mistake. It is a real tenor voice of pure Italian type, produced with rare force and growing more brilliant as it goes up the scale.
Never shall I forget the thrill of that moment when the final curtain had fallen, and we were called again and again to bow our acknowledgements. But sweeter than all was the sound of the voices from the gallery, shouting in unison, "We want Burke! We want Burke!" That night I couldn't sleep for wondering what the papers would say of me on the morrow. And then, when the next day came, I was half fearful to get the papers. When I did, I read such notices as I'd never dreamed of how, at last, an English tenor had been found to rank with the best in the world.
Great success of the new English tenor. Thomas Burke, the new English Rodolfo, with Lancashire as his home and Italy as his training ground, came following in the footsteps of Caruso, McCormack, and the great tenors of former years with remarkable success.
Mr. Burke's triumph. Covent Garden reveals new English tenor sensation.
Burke at Covent Garden wins fame in a single night.
At last, an English tenor with a voice equal to the greatest of the Italians.
It was among the most spectacular debuts in Covent Garden history. The great Madame Melba was completely eclipsed, and record companies were falling over themselves in their haste to get the former miner's signature on a contract. The race was eventually won by Columbia, for whom Burke recorded the hit aria from Bohème, Que gelida manina, Your Tiny Hand is Frozen. Here's part of it from the original pressing.
In povertà mia lieta, salo da gran signore, rimedi in disamore, per sogni e per chimere, e per castelli in aria. L'animo mio
More triumphs and more records followed. During the remainder of the 1919 season, Burke appeared as the Duke in Rigoletto, the Count in The Barber of Seville, and as Lieutenant Pinkerton in Madame Butterfly. The season concluded with 3 further performances of Bohème and more newspaper eulogies about the man who was now called the Lancashire Caruso.
Mr. Burke is one of the most talked-of men in London, the sensation of the season. His voice is a tenor of pure Italian flavour, and for a debutant, he displays an almost fabulous routine.
After a winter tour, Burke opened the 1920 season at Covent Garden, again with Bohème and again under the baton of Beecham. The Pearl Fishers followed, and then an audition before the composer Giacomo Puccini, who was in London in 1920 to supervise production of the English premieres of his one-act operas Gianni Schicchi and Il Tabarro. Burke was rehearsing for Puccini's established favourite Manon Lescaut, which was also being given. But when Puccini heard him, says Joe Winstanley, the performance was so good it got him all 3 parts.
Tom relates how he remembers Puccini wandering about in the auditorium while Tom sang parts of Manon Lescaut. And unknown to Tom, he then went to the management and said, "This is the man who ought to be singing in Gianni Schicchi and in Il Tabarro as well. Is there nothing we can do about that?"
Puccini made no secret of his admiration for Burke, saying he'd never heard his music more beautifully sung. But that season was the last Covent Garden, indeed Europe, was to see of the singing star for 7 years. In August 1920, and despite lucrative offers from all over Europe, he and Mari embarked on the Cunard liner Carmania, bound for New York, lured by the promise of £400 a night for appearances not in opera, but on the concert platform. It was, at the time, the highest fee ever offered to a British artist in the United States, and the man prepared to pay it was the impresario William Morris.
The trouble was that Morris wasn't an impresario for opera. He was a vaudevillian, really, and there was a big difference.
As the Burkes were to discover when the Carmania burst in New York.
I shall never forget the shock I got on my arrival in the States. The first thing that caught my eye on landing were some huge posters announcing my appearance.
William Morris announces the first American concert tour of Tom Burke, Ireland's greatest living tenor.
My spirit quailed, for I knew that fine tenor and singer of Irish ballads, John McCormack, had already established himself, and deservedly so, in the hearts of the American people. And I felt that there would be those who would resent this newcomer, whom they'd not heard so far, and of whom they were to be the judge, making this sort of claim. They wouldn't realize that I had nothing to do with it. I told Morris, quite frankly, "I reckon you've killed me before I start. I might just as well return to Europe." But he assured me that everything would be all right.
Tom and Mary Burke spent the next 4 days at Morris's home on the shores of Lake Saranac in the mountains of upstate New York. At their end, Burke stepped into the cauldron of the New York Hippodrome, second home of John McCormack and brim full with Irish Americans. The first part of the programme, a selection of operatic arias, was well received, but it was Irish ballads the audience had come to hear, and Burke duly obliged.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valleys are hushed and white with snow. I'll be here in a sunshine or in a shadow. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so.
I knew what this debut would mean to me, and I put my very soul into everything I did. But I was right, and Morris was wrong. I know I sang well. I'd be the last to deny it if it had been otherwise. My reception was good. But behind it, I could sense that spirit of resentment which I'd feared. And that was nothing to the vitriolic attacks made upon me by the critics the next day. And they all mentioned the extravagant claims that had been made for me.
Tom Burke disappoints. A big house waited in eager expectancy at the Hippodrome on Sunday evening for the appearance of Tom Burke. Those present had been told in advertisements and press notices that Tom Burke was the greatest Irish singer that had ever come to this country. But his voice and his method disappointed, particularly when he sang typical Irish songs. He lacked some of the fire and the poetic feeling one expects from a singer of this type. John McCormack need not worry.
I broke down beneath the weight of my sorrow and disappointment. And for 18 months, I never opened my lips in song. I couldn't sing. My voice was gone. And if ever man suffered agony, I did throughout those despairing months, when I didn't know whether it would ever come back again.
Bit by bit, however, and with the help of American friends, Burke put his career back together again. Mary, by this time an accomplished singer in her own right, had returned to England to try to make some money for them. Tom started to get work in revue and vaudeville, and as time went by, there were roles in opera too. He joined the Chicago Opera Company and eventually regained his star status, appearing mostly in New York. And with Mary away abroad, he had by this time asked her for a divorce, he was able to live a life free from matrimonial distractions. He had an eye for pretty women, and they him, not to mention an appetite for late nights, smoke-filled rooms, and rye whiskey.
Now, throwing a party in New York is somewhat different to the parties which are given over here, even amongst the elite. The prohibition racket seems to make it a point of honor with those who set out to entertain, to see that there are plenty of intoxicants about.
A sought-after party guest, Burke numbered politicians, millionaires, and celebrities amongst his friends, and when his operatic work was done, he'd entertain them with popular songs of the day, some of which he also recorded.
They asked me how I knew my true love was true. I, of course, replied, something here inside cannot be denied. someday you'll find all who love are blind. When your heart's on fire, you must realize the smoke gets in your eyes. So I chaff them and I gaily laugh to think they could doubt my love. Yet today my love has flown away. I am without my love. Now laughing friends deride, tears I cannot hide. So I smile and say, when a lovely flame dies, smoke gets in your eyes.
The partying and the drinking also meant Burke provided newspaper columnists with good copy. Famously, he once tried to pick a fight with the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Jack Dempsey, in a dispute over a woman. He was shot in the leg by a jealous husband, and on one occasion was beaten up by the mafia in a New York nightclub. Unable to sing, as a result, he took himself off to Atlantic City to recover, where the local Morning Telegraph announced his arrival in the following terms.
Tom Burke, famed tenor, arrived in Atlantic City today to recuperate from a visit to Tex Ginnon's nightclub. Or is it a jiu-jitsu academy? It was Tom's 35th birthday, and the boys made sure he got a present to remember the joint by. Did they just? Burke, so the story goes, and there's a battered nose, bruised face, and 7 missing teeth to back up his story, was badly beaten up in Tex's club. And then, to make sure of it, was beaten up again. What a load of guts this singing guy has.
By 1927, Burke had had enough of America. He was rich, he was famous, and he was bored. So when, one morning, a letter arrived offering a series of engagements in England, starting with a concert at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, he leapt at it, literally, leaving the very same morning, and with little, if any, thought given to the broken engagements and disappointed fans he was leaving behind.
I didn't care. I was going home. And I remember that when I saw the white cliffs of England looming in the distance, I burst into tears.
The Manchester concert was a great success, and at the same time Burke made a triumphant visit to his hometown of Lee. To those of his relatives who hadn't seen him since he set off for Italy, the local prodigy's return came as a revelation. His niece, Vera Burke.
You wouldn't have known it was Tom because of his accent. He didn't have a Lancashire accent like when he was young and he went away with. He'd been around the world, he'd been to Italy and in the States and had a chauffeur-driven big car. People just stared because they hadn't seen him like that before.
Once back in London, the tenor immediately re-established his reputation, filling the Albert Hall on his first engagement in the capital and drawing enthusiastic notices. This from the Daily Sketch.
The Albert Hall, unusually crowded for a brilliant afternoon, simply roared its applause, insisting on many encores, and Burke responded generously. Finally, the tenor was obliged to come forward and make a speech.
Burke's profile was further reinforced when he was drafted in at short notice to sing the Duke in Rigoletto at Covent Garden. The following season, 1928, he appeared there in Cavalleria Rusticana with Eva Turner and again in La Bohème, this time under Barbarolli. It was also during that season that young Patricia Burke caught the first glimpse of her famous father, or at least the first she could remember. She'd last seen him as a babe in arms in Italy. When Tom and Mari set out for America, she'd been left behind with her maternal grandmother. Since then, her parents' marriage had irretrievably broken down. The occasion was a dinner party at the Savoy restaurant to mark Patricia's 12th birthday. One moment, the crowded room was full of chatter. The next, a figure appeared at the doorway.
And suddenly all the chat stopped. And I thought, oh, what's happened? And I turned round and I followed their eyes, and there was this man. So I was looking round and saying, well, what's it all about? And they said, well, don't you know who that man was? And I said, no, who was that man? And it was your father.
As Patricia grew up, she learned that her father was notorious for his affairs with women, affairs which had begun even before her parents' departure for America.
He was very attractive. I think I've got some pictures which I'll show you afterwards. But he had a little moustache and, he was good looking.
Sort of matinee idol looks, aren't
Yes, actually, yes, you're dead right.
Very silent pictures,
That's
good
it.
looks.
Yes. Oh, the women, so I'm told, used to tumble for him all over the place, And I don't think he treated any of them very well. But I've always said too much wine, too many women, and not enough song,
As a result of Tom Burke's bad behaviour, Marie divorced him in 1928. She was, by that time, a substantial star in her own right, having toured in Australia and appearing in Showboat with Paul Robeson.
Then she said, I'm going to get divorced, you see. And he said, because he's a naughty old boy, he said, try and catch me. So she got the lawyer. They found out that he was staying in this place, hotel I think it was. So they were walking along. They said, how are you going to tell which room he's in? They're not going to tell you downstairs. And I don't know if you're right, I don't think they do it anymore, but people leave their shoes, or used to leave their shoes outside to be cleaned. I said, there, that's him. He said, how do you know? He says, because the toes are turned up. Apparently, his shoes, always the toes turned up.
So,
and it was him. Oh, yes, they went in and caught him in what is known as in flagranti delictu, I think is the name for it.
Mr. Tom Burke divorced. In the divorce court on Tuesday, Mr. Judge London, who is on the stage, for divorce from her husband, Mr. Thomas Aspinall Burke, an opera singer known as Tom Burke, on the grounds of his adultery at a private hotel at Bolton Street, Mayfair, London, with a woman cited as Mrs. Thomas.
That sort of publicity didn't go down well with impresarios and agents, and worse was to follow. Burke became arrogant and self-regarding. Despite his own success, he was prone to complaining that the operatic establishment ignored native singers in favour of fancy-sounding foreigners. He fell out with conductors, notably Barbarolli. He expressed his low opinion of producers. He even attacked those who paid to see and hear him.
I'm afraid that in the majority of cases, opera-going is only a pose with them. They don't go for the love of the thing. And like Ascot Week, it's a fashion display. Latest creations and gleaming jewels are of more importance than the opera itself.
It may have been true, but it was hardly politic to say so. Tact, however, had never been the Lancastrian's strong suit. Meanwhile, rumours spread about his drinking and womanizing. Some, for example, the claim that he'd had to have his stomach pumped out between acts at Covent Garden, are so unlikely as to be discounted. Others, however, says John Vose, actually happened.
He is said to have been invited to a one-night stand, which was at the Covent Garden Opera House, and it was a sort of a potted operatic tribute. And the royal family were present, and Tom came on, roaring drunk, in his Pagliacci outfit. And then after he had finished and the applause had died down, Tom paused and then looked up and he said, "Where's the king?" He said, "Ah, there he is," and he pointed up to the royal box, and then he pointed to his chest and he said, "I'm the king of song."
Tom Burke never sang at Covent Garden again, but it's unlikely the royal family was offended, because Burke was subsequently asked to sing the national anthem at the 1930 Royal Command performance, an occasion which led to more comment on his private life. As the tenor left the stage and made his way to his retiring room, he was congratulated by a well-wisher. As Burke shook hands, the young man, in reality a solicitor's agent, served him with a writ for alimony.
Tom Burke receives 2 commands in one night,
giggled the Daily Press the next morning, amid speculation that Burke had been too drunk to attend the final curtain call. Ironically, the next year, Marie Burke was invited to sing the national anthem. As her career prospered, she was later to star in films like The Lavender Hill Mob and to be a founder member of the Actors' Union Equity. So Tom's foundered. He continued to criticize the establishment while failing to turn up for rehearsals and breaking engagements. It was, however, a prolific period for him in the recording studio. a bit too prolific for the taste of his record company, Columbia, which discovered he was breaking his contract by singing under false names for other companies. Record collector Joe Winstanley again.
He would change to almost any name you can think of that had a slight Irish connotation. So he would be Terry O'Neill for Edison, Pat Nolan for Metropole and Piccadilly, Pat O'Sullivan for Piccadilly, and I have seen a copy of the original contract that he had with Columbia, and this is scored out in ink, and the words "contract broken" written across it.
Up until this time, and in spite of his plummeting reputation, Burke had lived the life of a gentleman in a flat in Cadogan Square in Mayfair. He had a butler, a chauffeur for his Rolls-Royce, and was to be seen riding in Rotten Row. His wealth was built on investments made during his successful years in the United States. The Wall Street crash changed all that. Suddenly he had nothing, and no option but to file his own petition in bankruptcy. In an effort to make a living, and noting that the Depression had left many professional singers out of work, he formed a choir, which he called the Human Voice Orchestra.
They were mainly out-of-work Gilbert and Sullivan singers, and Tom decided that he would call this a Human Voice Orchestra, partly because I think he always was fascinated with words and with little jokes, and I think this was one of Tom's little jokes. The only record that survives is the Storm Along record, and of course his companions do sound as if they're full of voice, but they also sound to me as though they're full of beer.
The Human Voice Orchestra was a flop, and by 1934, Burke was on his uppers.
Tom Burke yesterday talked to a Sunday Express representative in a tiny, rented room in South Kensington. For Tom Burke has no home of his own. He has not earned a penny for a year.
The following year, Burke was making headlines again, but for a rather different reason.
Tom Burke's marriage secret. It was revealed yesterday that Tom Burke, the tenor, had married Miss Pauline Steele Dixon. They had kept the marriage secret for a week. Mr. Burke is 38, his bride 22.
The circumstances surrounding the tenor's second marriage were quite as extraordinary as any of the events in his life. The young Miss Steele Dixon, who came from a wealthy and socially prominent family, had seen Burke in a club and fallen headlong in love with him. Despite being warned that the singer was a notorious playboy, and to the dismay of her family, she determined to marry him. When he showed no sign of returning her affection, she decided on extreme measures and invited the tenor for what she said would be a day out with friends.
She actually hijacked Tom, pretending that they were going on a trip, and took him with some friends who turned out to be the witnesses. She'd organised it all, took him to the registry office, and they got married. And it was a tempestuous marriage at times, but Pauline was absolutely madly in love with him to the very day she died.
During which Burke left her and returned at least 3 times. The good looks that attracted Pauline Steele Dixon gave Tom Burke a brief film career in the late 30s, when he starred in 3 whimsical musicals set in Ireland: Father O'Flynn, Kathleen Mavourneen, and My Irish Molly. Here's a snippet of the soundtrack from My Irish Molly.
Sure I will. Come on, Eileen.
Danny, give me one of my old favourites.
I'll give you the grandest tune I know. Come on, my dear.
Just as we did at Mrs. Murphy's.
The self-same. Oh, Eileen, dear, I bless the fate that brought me o'er yonder...
Recognize the female voice? It was the young and then unknown Maureen O'Hara, on her way to stardom, just as Burke was on his way to obscurity. Though the films had little artistic merit, they did at least offer Burke the chance to show off his vocal talent before a wide public once again. Here he is in the title song from Kathleen Mavourneen.
Kathleen Mahoney in the cradle is breaking, the horn of the hunter is heard on the hill. The lark from her light wing, the bright is shaking. Kathleen Mahoney, what slumbering still.
Who can say whether Burke's screen career might have gone further? As events turned out, the Second World War intervened. The singer, accompanied by Pauline, joined Ensa and spent the next 5 years entertaining the troops. After the war, the Burkes settled back in Lee, where Tom taught singing and was briefly a steward in a golf club and a bookies runner. He also sang when and where he could in the pubs and clubs around Manchester. It was the nadir of his career. On one occasion, a club owner offered him £1 for an evening singing, oblivious that the man before him had, just 20 years earlier, commanded £400 a night. Then, in the early 50s, Burke launched his own private members' arts club in Lee, backed by a Halifax bookie. It quickly acquired a somewhat bohemian reputation, at least by Lee's standards, and word reached the singer's niece, Vera, that the police were planning a raid.
The news had got around, and I said to Tom that the arts club was going to be raided. I said I didn't know when, and he said, "Oh, don't be so bloody stupid," and he didn't take any notice of me.
But raided the club was, and people in Lee still recall the night. 24 police officers stormed in to find drinks on the tables after time and in the hands of non-members. The arts club was promptly shut down by magistrates, and thereafter the singer left his hometown for good, returning to live in London and later in Sutton in Surrey. He continued to teach, and the few who heard him sing continued to be impressed, among them Lord Harwood, the former director of the Royal Opera House. He recalls a visit from Burke in the late 50s. The tenor ostensibly had brought along one of his pupils to sing, but it soon became clear that was just a pretext.
Then Tom Burke said, "Of course, you and I still sing a bit." And I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "My voice is much the same. You know, I haven't done any work, really. I can knock spots off most of the ones you have at Covent Garden. You'd like to hear me?" So I said, "Well, I certainly would." So he said, "You got the score of, you got Tosca, Manolesco. You got the score of Manolesco?" So I said yes, and I went and fetched the score of Manolesco. And Tom Burke sort of looked through the pages as if he hadn't really made up his mind what to sing. And then he said, let's do this bit, do this bit here. And he made a wonderful sound, an absolutely wonderful sound. Not a young sound, but a full, strong, rich, gutsy sound. It was a very remarkable sound.
And by good fortune, that sound was captured in a single late recording of Tom Burke made in 1961 when he was 71. The title, O Primavera, Springtime.
Libera e gioconda primavera che ridi sulla terra, i giorni schiuri cantico di serra, d'amore gioia l'anima m'inonda. O primavera cantami tutti, le notti ardente dall'alta del sole, dammi i raggi, dammi le viole di primavera l'anima
For the last decade of his life, Burke lived alone. His second wife, Pauline, died in 1958. He gathered round him a group of loyal pupils who would sit drinking late into the night as the tenor told of his adventures with Caruso and Melba, Puccini and Beecham. Joe Winstanley, reflecting on what might have been, believes Burke's name could have been remembered along with theirs, but for his own self-destruction. So what went wrong? Was it really just the drinking and the women, or was there something deeper?
He did like womanizing, and there are amazing stories of his feats of sexual athleticism going right up into his 60s and early 70s. But I think they were only a contributory factor. I think the main thing that drove him from the stage was his own lack of confidence. He consistently, in the late 20s and early 30s, failed to turn up to quite important concert engagements. And I don't think, in most cases, I don't think it was drink or women. I think it was sheer lack of guts, that he just didn't want to face the public, and it became too much for him. He was frightened maybe of failing. He was perhaps hadn't fully accustomed himself to the huge jump from being a miner's son in Lee to an international celebrity, and somehow or another there was still a void there in his personality that meant, you know, perhaps I can't do it, perhaps I've no business being here. And this is very sad, because in fact he'd every right to be there.
Tom Burke, the Lancashire Caruso, died on the 13th of December 1969 in his 80th year. He was buried, largely unmourned by the musical profession, in Wallington Cemetery in Surrey. Inscribed on the simple headstone are the words, "Never have I heard my music more beautifully sung." Puccini.
The Lancashire Caruso was presented by John Waite and researched by Rebecca Wells. The producer was Graham Ellis.